Hey, good morning. Good morning, everybody. All right. So I'm in ancient Greece right now, and it's beautiful. There's a slight breeze. The weather is wonderful. I'm enjoying myself. I'm going to eat some more olives and feta later. I'm a big fan of the Greek salad. All right. So let's keep going right now. We're going to go into about three myths today: Eos, Helios, and Selene. And we'll just go through all three, and we'll start right now. The story of Eos. Eos, gentle dawn, was the mother of the four winds. We read about them yesterday. While all creation slept, she rose from her pink pillows to announce the coming of the new day, which is correct, the coming of the new day. She dipped her rosy fingers into a cup filled with dew and sprinkled the drops over flowers and trees. All nature awoke, rejoicing to see her. One morning, as Eos looked down on earth, her eyes fell on a young prince waking from his slumber. He was so handsome, she could not take her eyes off him, and she wanted him for her husband. But how could she, who was a goddess, be married to a mortal whose lifespan was so short? Soon as her morning duties were done, she went to Zeus and persuaded him to grant eternal life to the young prince, whose name was Tithonus. She brought him home with her to her palace in the east, and they spent many delightful years together. But Eos had forgotten to ask that Tithonus be also given eternal youth, and slowly his strength left his once supple limbs. He shriveled and shrank, and his manly voice changed to a feeble squeak. He shrank to a tiny, wizened old man, yet he could not die, for he had been given eternal life. He became so small and weak that Eos had to put him into a little basket and hide him in the corner of her palace. There, in his dark corner, he went on withering and shriveling till at last he turned into a grasshopper, chirping for all eternity. But Eos stayed rosy and young, always a joy to behold when she came out to wake the sleeping world and announce the coming of her brother, the sun. So asking Zeus for something, you have to be careful. It's like when you ask a genie for wishes or something. You have to be very careful and very thorough in what you're asking for. All right. Let's move on to her brother Helios. Helios the sun mounted his glowing chariot and drove out in great splendor as soon as Eos threw open the gates of his golden palace in the east. His radiance lit up the wide expanse of sky. So bright was he that only the gods could look straight at him without being blinded. Brilliant rays encircled his head, and his chariot glowed like fire. With a strong hand, Helios guided his four fiery steeds up the vault of the heavens. The path was steep and narrow, and the horses were wild, but Helios held them well on their course. At high noon, he stopped at the top of the sky and looked around, and nothing could escape his piercing gaze. Again, he drove on, and now he gave free rein to his steeds. Far to the west, they could see his glittering evening palace, and eager to reach their stables, they raced on the downhill course, faster and faster. They passed a great herd of white cows hurrying homeward to Helios's palace and met a large flock of sheep going out to pasture in the sky. For Helios owned a snow white cow for each day of the year and a woolly sheep for each night. The shadows grew long and dusk settled over the world when Helios and his foaming team arrived. His five daughters, the Heliads, awaited them. They unharnessed and tied, or I'm sorry, they unharnessed the tired horses and let them plunge into the ocean for a cooling bath. Then the horses rested in their stables, and Helios talked with his daughters and told them all he had seen that day. In the dark of the night, he boarded a vessel of gold with his team and sailed around the world back to his palace in the east. The way was far shorter by sea than by air, so he had time to stay for a while in his morning palace too before he set out on another day's journey. Okay. Helios had a son named Phaethon. He was mortal, and was very proud of his radiant father. One morning, as Helios was about to set off on his daily journey across the sky, Phaethon came to him and begged him to grant his dearest wish. It never ends well when they do this, but okay. Helios, who was very fond of his handsome son, rashly swore by the river Styx to give him any wish he might have. But when he heard Phaethon's wish, he sorely regretted his oath. He tried in vain to make his son change his mind, for what Phaethon wanted was to drive the sun chariot for one day. And Helios knew that no one but he himself could handle the spirited steeds. Phaethon was determined to have his wish, and Helios had to give in. Sadly, he put his golden rays on his son's head and rubbed divine ointment on his skin so he could withstand the searing heat of the chariot. He barely had time to warn him to stay well in the middle of the heavenly path when the gates of the palace were thrown open and the rearing horses were brought forth. Phaethon leaped into the chariot, grasped the reins, and the horses rushed out. At first, all went well, and Phaethon stood proudly in the glowing chariot. But the fiery steeds soon felt that unskilled hands were holding the reins. They veered off the heavenly path and brushed by the dangerous constellations that lurked on both sides of it. The animals of the zodiac were enraged. The bull charged, the lion growled, the scorpion lashed out with its poisonous tail. The horses shied, and Phaethon was thrown halfway out of the chariot. Far below, he saw the earth, and he grew so dizzy that he dropped the reins. Without a firm hand to guide them, the horses bolted. They raced so close to the earth that the ground cracked from the heat of the chariot, and rivers and lakes dried up. Then upward they sped so high that the earth froze and turned to ice. Zeus stood on Olympus, shook his head. He had to stop the careening chariot to save the earth from destruction, and he threw a thunderbolt at it. In a shower of sparks, the chariot flew apart and Phaethon plunged into the river Po. On the riverbanks, his sisters mourned so long that Zeus took pity on them and changed them into poplar trees, and their tears into drops of gold and amber. Hephaestus had to work the whole night through to mend the broken chariot so Helios could drive it again the next day. Helios grieved over his lost son, and he never again allowed anyone to drive his chariot except for Apollo, the god of light. Okay. And now we'll go to Selene. Selene, the moon, came out at night to light up the world while her brother Helios was resting. Slowly she drove her milk-white horses across the sky, and her pale moonbeams fell gently on the sleeping earth, where all was peace and quiet. One night, Selene's soft light fell on Endymion, a young shepherd who was sleeping beside his flock. She stopped to look at him. He was smiling in his sleep and was so young and handsome that she completely lost her heart to him. She drove through the night, but she could not get him out of her mind. When her duties were over, she went to Zeus and asked him to grant Endymion eternal sleep so he would stay forever young and handsome. She had learned from her sister Eos not to ask for eternal life for a mortal and be left with a grasshopper on her hands. Zeus granted Selene's wish, and Endymion slept on, smiling in his sleep. He dreamed that he held the moon in his arms, but it was not a dream. After all, Selene bore her husband 50 daughters, all pale and beautiful as their mother, and sleepy as their father. In Selene's magic light, river gods rose from silvery streams to inspect their riverbeds, and hills trembled under the hoofs of the wild centaurs. Laughing nymphs and bleating satyrs danced to the music of Pan, the god of nature, master of them all. So that will be tomorrow. We'll learn about Pan. All right. Talk to you later. Have a nice day. Goodbye for now.